Harlem, 1935. 3 bodies were supposed to be found in the East River that morning. 3 men who'd stolen from the wrong people, who'd crossed the wrong lines, who'd been marked for death in the way that dozens of men were marked every month in New York. The contract was issued. The payment was made. The shooters were hired. Professional killers. Men who'd done this work before. Men who knew how to make bodies disappear quietly. The hit was supposed to happen on a Tuesday night, corner of 142nd and Lenox, after midnight, when the streets were empty enough that witnesses would be few and unreliable. The 3 targets were mid-level operators, numbers runners who'd been skimming off the top, taking money that belonged to a larger operation, taking money that belonged to Dutch Schultz. In the world of organized crime in 1930s New York, stealing from Dutch Schultz meant one thing: death. Not a beating, not a warning. Death. Schultz had built his reputation on this principle. You steal from me, you die. Publicly when possible. Violently always. It was good business. It kept people honest. It kept money flowing in the right direction. So when 3 of his runners were caught skimming, when the amounts were verified, when the evidence was clear, Schultz did what he always did. He issued a contract. $5,000. Split between 2 shooters. Payment on completion. The shooters were professionals. They'd worked for Schultz before. They knew the targets. They knew the location. They knew the timeline. Tuesday night, 142nd and Lenox, after midnight. They arrived early, found their positions, waited. The 3 targets appeared exactly on schedule, walking together, talking, laughing, unaware. The shooters moved into position, weapons drawn, safety off. And then something happened. A man stepped out from a doorway, alone, unarmed, as far as anyone could see. He walked directly toward the 3 targets, not running, not hurrying, just walking. The shooters hesitated. This wasn't part of the plan. This was a complication. The man reached the 3 targets, spoke to them, quietly. The shooters couldn't hear what was said. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Then the 3 targets turned around, walked back the way they'd come, disappeared around a corner. The man who'd intercepted them stood there for a moment, then looked directly at the doorway where one of the shooters was hiding, made eye contact, didn't say anything, didn't make a threatening gesture, just looked, then walked away in the opposite direction. The shooters waited, confused. The targets were gone. The window had passed. They reported back to Schultz the next morning, told him what happened, described the man who'd interfered. Schultz knew immediately who it was. He made a decision that surprised everyone in his organization. He canceled the contract, absorbed the loss, let the 3 runners live. Dutch Schultz, the man who'd shot someone in a crowded restaurant in front of 30 witnesses, the man who'd built an empire on the principle that disrespect meant death. He backed down. Not because the man who interfered was armed, not because he'd been threatened, not because violence had been promised. He backed down because he couldn't predict what would happen if he didn't. That man on the corner of 142nd and Lenox was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Harlem called him Bumpy. 3 bodies were supposed to be in the East River that morning. Instead, 3 men were still alive, still working, still running numbers. And Dutch Schultz, the most violent gangster in New York, had walked away from a contract he'd already paid for. No shots fired, no blood spilled, no bodies found, just one man, one conversation, one look, and everything changed. This documentary is about power. Real power. Not the power that comes from pulling a trigger. Not the power that comes from having the biggest crew, or the most guns, or the willingness to kill anyone who gets in your way. Different power. The power that comes from making men like Dutch Schultz decide that fighting you isn't worth the cost. The power that comes from what people fear you might do, not what you've already done. The power that comes from silence, from patience, from consequences that arrive without warning and without explanation. Bumpy Johnson built an empire in Harlem that lasted for decades. He did it without becoming the most violent man in the city, without having the biggest crew, without pulling his gun every time someone challenged him. He did it by understanding something that most gangsters never learned, that in a world where everyone expects violence, restraint becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. This is the story of the man who rarely pulled the trigger, and why that made him the most feared criminal in New York. The numbers tell part of the story, but numbers don't capture the atmosphere, the feeling of walking those streets. Harlem in 1930 was a place where everyone understood the rules, where everyone knew how things worked. You knew which blocks were whose. You knew which clubs were safe and which ones weren't. You knew who to pay, when to pay them, and what happened if you didn't. You knew that arguments could turn into beatings in seconds, that disrespect could mean death, that owing money meant living on borrowed time. This wasn't paranoia. This was reality. Let me give you a sense of how quickly things could escalate, how normal violence was. June 1930, a policy game operating out of a barbershop on 135th Street. Policy games were simple. Numbers racket. People bet on 3-digit numbers. If your number hit, you won. The house took a percentage. Small bets, nickels, dimes, quarters, but thousands of people playing. The money added up. This particular game was run by a man named Samuel Green. He'd been running it for 2 years. Small operation. Maybe 8 blocks of regular customers. One evening, a customer came in claiming he'd won. Said his number had hit. Wanted his payout. Green checked his records. The number hadn't hit. The customer was wrong, or lying. Green told him no payout. The customer insisted. Got loud. Other customers were present. About a dozen people in the shop. Green told him again. No payout. You didn't win. The customer reached into his jacket. Green was faster. Had a pistol under the counter. Drew it. Fired twice. The customer went down, dead before he hit the floor. The other customers scattered. Out the door. Into the street. Gone. Green called the man who protected his territory. Explained what happened. Self-defense. Customer was reaching for a weapon. The body was moved. The floor was cleaned. The shop was open for business the next morning. No police investigation. No arrest. No consequences. That was normal. That was a Tuesday evening in Harlem. Violence wasn't an escalation. It was the first response. Because hesitation got you killed. August 1930. A speakeasy on Lenox Avenue. 2 men got into an argument over a woman. Both were drunk. Both were armed. The argument started at the bar. Voices raised. Insults exchanged. The bartender saw where it was going. Tried to intervene. Offered to buy them both drinks. Calm things down. Too late. One man threw a punch. The other man pulled a knife. The first man pulled a gun. 3 shots fired. The man with the knife went down. Wounded, but alive. The man with the gun ran. Out the door. Into the street. Gone. The wounded man was carried to a back room. A doctor was called. The kind of doctor who didn't ask questions. Didn't file reports. The bullet was removed. The wound was cleaned. The man survived. The bartender mopped up the blood. The speakeasy was open for business an hour later. No police, no investigation, no consequences. That was normal. That was a Friday night in Harlem. Violence wasn't shocking. It was expected. September 1930. A dispute over territory between 2 numbers operations. One operation was expanding, moving into blocks that another operation considered theirs. The first operation sent a warning. Verbal. Clear. Stay out of our territory. The second operation ignored the warning, kept expanding. The first operation sent a second warning, this time physical. Beat up one of the rival's runners, sent him back with a message. The second operation responded. Attacked one of the first operation's collection points. Destroyed property. Sent their own message. Back and forth. Escalating. Finally, the first operation decided to end it. 4 men, armed, went to where the rival operation was based, a social club on 141st Street. They walked in at 9 at night. 20 people present, playing cards, drinking, socializing. The 4 men opened fire, indiscriminate, shooting at anything that moved. 3 dead, 7 wounded. The rest fled or hid. The 4 shooters left. The bodies remained. Police arrived, took statements. No one had seen anything. No one could identify the shooters. Case closed within a week. Unsolved. That was normal. That was how territorial disputes were resolved. This was the world Bumpy Johnson entered. A world where violence was the primary communication method. Where reputation was built on bodies. Where survival required constant vigilance and immediate retaliation. The men who succeeded in this world were the men who understood these rules, who embraced them, who became fluent in the language of violence. Dutch Schultz succeeded because he was willing to be more violent than anyone else, more public, more shocking. Mad Dog Call succeeded because he was unpredictable. You couldn't prepare for him, couldn't anticipate him. Lucky Luciano succeeded because he was efficient, strategic, organized, but all of them succeeded through violence. That was the only path anyone knew. That was the only path that made sense. So when Stephanie St. Clair hired Bumpy Johnson in 1930, everyone assumed he would follow the same path. Stephanie St. Clair was known as Queenie. She ran the largest independent numbers operation in Harlem. Independent meant she didn't answer to the Italian mobs, didn't pay tribute, kept all her profits. This made her wealthy. It also made her a target. By 1930, Dutch Schultz was looking to expand into Harlem. He wanted control of the numbers games, the policy operations, the gambling. He'd sent messages to the independent operators, including Stephanie St. Clair. The message was simple. Work with us. Pay tribute. Or we take everything by force. Most operators agreed. It was easier, safer. Better to pay a percentage than lose everything. Stephanie St. Clair refused. She needed protection. Someone who could stand between her operation and Dutch Schultz's organization. She needed an enforcer. Someone with a reputation. Someone dangerous. She hired Bumpy Johnson. At the time, Bumpy was 25 years old. He'd already served time in Sing Sing. Already had a reputation for being smart, careful, and effective. But he wasn't known for being particularly violent. He wasn't feared the way Schultz was feared. Wasn't unpredictable like Call. People wondered if Stephanie had made a mistake. If she'd hired someone who wasn't violent enough for the job. If she needed someone who could actually protect her operation from Dutch Schultz. They were about to find out. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina on October 31st, 1905. His childhood was unremarkable. Poor family, no opportunities. The same story as millions of other black children born in the South at the turn of the century. When he was 14, his family moved to Harlem. 1919. Part of the Great Migration. They were chasing opportunity, a better life, the promise of the North. What they found was complicated. Better than the South in some ways, worse in others. Young Bumpy found the streets quickly. Like most teenage boys in his situation, he looked for ways to make money that didn't involve working for poverty wages in jobs that would never lead anywhere. But from the beginning, he was different. Most young men who entered the criminal world did so with their fists, their muscles, their willingness to be violent. Bumpy entered it with his mind. He watched. He listened. He studied. While other young runners were trying to prove how tough they were, Bumpy was trying to understand how the system worked, who answered to whom, where money flowed, how territory was divided, why certain people had power and others didn't. He spent money differently too. Most runners, when they made their first real money, spent it on clothes, jewelry, visibility, showing everyone they were making it. Bumpy spent his money on books, not novels, not entertainment, books on strategy, military history, psychology. He read about Napoleon's campaigns, how Napoleon built an empire, not just through military strength, but through understanding his enemies better than they understood themselves. He read about Sun Tzu, The art of war. Ancient Chinese military strategy. The concept that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. He read about political power, how governments controlled populations, how fear could be manufactured and maintained. People thought he was strange, a young black man in Harlem reading military strategy and philosophy while working as a numbers runner. But Bumpy understood something. The streets were a battlefield. Territory was won and lost, like countries at war. And the people who studied war had already figured out the principles that worked. He was just applying them to a different context. In 1924, Bumpy was arrested for armed robbery. He was 19 years old. He was convicted, sentenced to 4 years in Sing Sing, a maximum security prison north of New York City. Most young men entered prison and came out hardened, more violent, more criminal, less human. Bumpy entered prison and turned it into a classroom. Sing Sing in the 1920s was brutal, overcrowded, violent, a place where weakness meant death and strength meant survival. But it was also a place where the rules were clear, visible, predictable. In the outside world, power was complicated, hidden, subtle. In prison, power was simple. You could see it, map it, study it. Bumpy watched how the prison gangs operated, how territory was divided, how alliances were formed and broken. He noticed patterns. The most violent prisoners weren't necessarily the most powerful. They were feared, yes, but they were also isolated. No one wanted to be around them. No one trusted them. The most powerful prisoners were the ones who controlled resources, information, access. The prisoners who could get things, cigarettes, food, protection, letters smuggled in and out. They weren't always the biggest, weren't always the toughest, but they were the most connected. Bumpy also noticed something else. The prisoners who fought every day, who responded to every insult with violence, they didn't last long. They got injured, got isolated, got transferred, got killed. But the prisoners who were selective, who only fought when necessary, who built reputations not on constant violence, but on occasional, devastating violence, they controlled entire cell blocks. It was about unpredictability. A man who fought every day became predictable. People knew how to handle him, avoid him, wait for him to make mistakes. But a man who was quiet for months, who seemed peaceful, who then suddenly struck without warning, that man terrified everyone, because no one could predict when it would happen, when the next strike would come, who the next target would be. That uncertainty created fear, and fear created control. Bumpy spent 4 years studying this, 4 years watching, learning, understanding. He left prison in 1928 with a completely different understanding of power. Violence wasn't about frequency. It was about timing. Reputation wasn't about what you did yesterday. It was about what people feared you might do tomorrow. Control wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the most unpredictable. When he returned to Harlem in 1928, he was different from the teenager who'd left 4 years earlier. He was 23 years old, educated in ways that no school could teach, ready to apply what he'd learned. He started working again, numbers running, collections, the same work as before. But his approach was different. Other enforcers were loud, visible, making sure everyone saw them, making sure everyone knew how tough they were. Bumpy was quiet, observant. He spoke less, watched more. When confrontations happened, other enforcers responded immediately, physically, making examples. Bumpy often didn't respond at all, at least not immediately. Sometimes days would pass, then something would happen. The person who'd caused problems would have complications. Nothing directly connected to Bumpy, but everyone suspected. People started to notice. This young enforcer who carried himself differently, who didn't fit the pattern. In 1930, Stephanie St. Clair noticed. She was looking for someone to protect her operation from Dutch Schultz. Someone capable, someone intelligent. Most people told her to hire the toughest, most violent enforcer available. someone who could match Schultz's violence. But Stephanie was smart. She understood that violence could be matched with more violence. That if she hired a violent enforcer, Schultz would just send more violent people. And it would escalate until everyone was dead. She needed something different. She needed someone who could protect her territory without starting a war she couldn't win. She hired Bumpy Johnson. Not because he was the most violent, because he was the most intelligent. When Bumpy accepted the job, everyone wondered if Stephanie had made a mistake. Dutch Schultz was known for extreme violence, public violence, violence that made statements. Could someone like Bumpy actually stand up to that? The answer came quickly, and it wasn't what anyone expected. The first real test came in February 1931. Dutch Schultz had been moving into Harlem for months, slowly, methodically, taking over independent operations one at a time. His method was simple. Send representatives, make an offer, work with us, or we destroy you. Most operators took the offer. It was safer. A percentage of profits was better than no profits at all. Stephanie St. Clair had refused, multiple times. Schultz decided to make an example. He sent 4 men to one of Stephanie's main collection points, a social club on 139th Street, where her runners brought money every evening. The 4 men arrived at 8 p.m. peak collection time. Dozens of people present. They walked in armed, shotguns visible, intent clear. The room went silent. Everyone recognized what was happening. Schultz's men were here to send a message. One of the men spoke. Loud, clear. We're taking over this operation, starting tonight. Anyone who works for Stephanie St. Clair needs to make a choice. Work for us or find different work. He looked around the room, making eye contact, making sure everyone understood. Stephanie St. Clair has been told to cooperate. She refused. That was a mistake. We're correcting that mistake. At a table in the back corner, Bumpy Johnson sat alone. He'd been reviewing collection receipts, paper and pencil in front of him. No weapon visible. One of Schultz's men noticed him, walked over. You work for Queenie? Bumpy looked up. Calm. I do. Not anymore. She's done. You can work for us or you can leave. Bumpy set down his pencil. Carefully. Precisely. I'll stay where I am. The room was completely silent now. Everyone watching. Everyone knowing what should happen next. The man standing over Bumpy pulled back his jacket, showing the pistol in his waistband. I don't think you understand the situation. Bumpy looked at the pistol, then back at the man's face. I understand perfectly. The man's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped. Because something in Bumpy's expression, something in his absolute calm, made the man hesitate. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly what will happen next. The man didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he looked back at his partners, uncertain. One of the other Schultz men came over, older, more experienced. He looked at Bumpy for a long moment. We'll be back tomorrow. You should think carefully about your decision. Then they left, all 4 of them, walking out the same door they'd come through. No shots fired, no violence, no confrontation. Everyone in that room was confused. Schultz's men had come to take over. They'd had weapons. They'd had numbers. Why had they left? Bumpy went back to his receipts, like nothing had happened. The next morning, one of Schultz's men was arrested. Federal charges, tax evasion. The evidence was extensive. Years of unreported income, bank records, property records, everything organized and documented. The arrest was public. Federal agents, multiple cars, photographers present. That afternoon, a second Schultz lieutenant had problems. His primary alcohol supplier suddenly couldn't deliver. Equipment failures, truck problems, unexplained complications. That evening, Schultz himself received information, anonymous, detailed, about police raids being planned on 3 of his warehouses. The information was accurate. The raids happened within 48 hours. None of this was directly connected to the incident at Stephanie's collection point. But everyone understood. Schultz's men never returned to that social club. The takeover attempt stopped, not because of a gunfight, not because Bumpy had killed anyone, not because violence had been threatened, because the cost had suddenly become unpredictable. Schultz's organization could handle violence. They were good at violence, but they couldn't handle this. Arrests that appeared from nowhere, evidence that shouldn't exist, raids based on information that should have been secret. It was like fighting a ghost. That was the first time. The first time people saw what Bumpy Johnson could do without pulling a trigger. But it wasn't the last. April 1931. A territory dispute. A crew from the Bronx decided to expand into Harlem. They were running protection rackets, shaking down businesses, taking payments. Some of those businesses were already paying Stephanie St. Clair for protection. The Bronx crew didn't care, figured there was room for competition, figured businesses could pay twice, or figure out who they were more afraid of. The crew was led by a man named Vincent Corso, mid-level operator, ambitious, violent. Corso had a reputation. He'd beaten several business owners who refused to pay, put 2 of them in the hospital, made examples. In May, Corso walked into a restaurant on 145th Street. Italian restaurant, family-owned, been there for 15 years. The owner, Antonio Ricci, was behind the counter. Corso walked up to him. "You pay protection?" Ricci nodded. "Yes, to Miss St. Clair's people." "That's nice. Now you pay us too. $50 a week." Ricci looked confused. "I already pay $30 a week." "Now you pay $80. $50 to us. $30 to whoever. I don't care." "I can't afford that." Corso leaned across the counter. "Close. Then you can't afford to stay in business." He swept his arm across the counter, knocked over a display of wine bottles. Glass shattered. Wine spread across the floor. "Next time it won't be bottles." Then he left. Ricci called the number he'd been given. Stephanie's people. Reported what happened. The message reached Bumpy that afternoon. He went to Ricci's restaurant that evening. Sat at a table. Ordered dinner. While he ate, he asked questions. What exactly did Corso say? What did he look like? Who was with him? When did he say he'd be back? Ricci answered everything. Nervous, uncertain whether this quiet man could actually help. Bumpy finished his meal, paid, left a generous tip. "Don't worry about Corso." That was all he said. 3 days later, Corso returned. Same time, same attitude. He walked up to the counter. Ricci was there again. "You got my money?" Ricci shook his head. "I can't pay both." Corso smiled, not a friendly smile. Wrong answer. He reached across the counter, grabbed a stack of plates, threw them on the floor. Ceramic shattered. "Next time it's windows, then furniture, then you." He turned to leave. Bumpy was sitting at a table by the window. Same table as 3 days before. Corso saw him, stopped. "You got a problem?" Bumpy looked up. Calm. No aggression. "No problem." "Then why are you looking at me?" "I'm not. I'm eating." Corso walked over to the table, stood over Bumpy. "You work for Queenie?" "I do." "Tell Queenie her protection doesn't work anymore. This is our territory now." Bumpy set down his fork. Carefully. "That's not how territory works." Corso laughed. "Yeah? Who's going to stop me? You?" Bumpy didn't respond, just looked at Corso. That same calm expression. Corso felt it. That same hesitation that Schultz's men had felt. That sense that something wasn't right. He backed up a step. "I'll be back next week, with more people. We'll see how calm you are then." He left, walked out to his car where 2 of his men were waiting. They drove away. Bumpy went back to his meal. 1 week later, Vincent Corso's protection racket in the Bronx collapsed. Not violently, not dramatically. His collection points were raided. Police, multiple locations, simultaneous timing. Evidence was found. Records, money, weapons. Corso was arrested, held without bail. The charges were serious. Federal, racketeering. His crew scattered. Some joined other operations. Some left the business entirely. The expansion into Harlem stopped immediately. Antonio Ricci never saw Corso again, never paid him a single dollar, and Bumpy never mentioned the incident again. But everyone heard about it. The story spread. Another crew that tried to move into Harlem. Another problem that disappeared without violence. People started to understand. Confronting Bumpy Johnson didn't end with bullets. It ended with everything falling apart. June 1931. A more personal test. A young enforcer named Marcus Bell decided Bumpy's reputation was overrated. Bell was 23 years old, strong, aggressive. He'd built his reputation through street fights, bar brawls, public violence. He worked for a small operation in East Harlem. Numbers running. Nothing sophisticated. But Bell had ambitions. He wanted to move up, wanted to make a name for himself. He decided the fastest way to build his reputation was to tear down someone else's. He chose Bumpy. Bell started talking. In clubs, on street corners, wherever people would listen. Said Bumpy Johnson was a fraud. Said his reputation was built on luck. Said he'd never actually done anything. Said that if they ever met face to face, he'd prove Bumpy was nothing. The talk spread. People repeated it, embellished it. Within 2 weeks, everyone in Harlem had heard Marcus Bell talking about Bumpy Johnson. Everyone expected a response, expected Bumpy to confront Bell, to fight him publicly, to defend his reputation the way reputations were always defended. Nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks. Bell became bolder, started saying Bumpy was afraid, that he was hiding. One Saturday night in July, Bell went to a club on Lenox Avenue. The Savoy. Crowded. Popular. The kind of place where everyone would see what happened. Bumpy was there, at the bar, alone. Bell walked over. Deliberate. Everyone in the immediate area noticed. Conversation stopped. Bell stood next to Bumpy at the bar, ordered a drink, didn't look at him, then spoke, loud enough to be heard. "I've been hearing about you for months. Everyone talks about how dangerous you are, how smart you are, how everyone should be afraid of you." Bumpy didn't respond, didn't look over, just stood there with his drink. "But I've been watching, and you know what I see? Nothing. Just a man standing at a bar." Bell turned now, facing Bumpy directly. "I don't think you're dangerous at all. I think you're lucky. I think you've been around long enough that people forget you've never actually done anything." The bartender had stopped moving. Frozen. Waiting. Bumpy took a sip of his drink. Slow. Deliberate. Then set the glass down. Looked at Bell. "You might be right." Bell blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. "What?" "You might be right. Maybe I'm just lucky." Bell laughed. Nervous. Unsure. "That's it? That's all you've got to say?" "What else should I say?" "I just called you out, in front of everyone, and you're just going to stand there?" Bumpy picked up his drink again. "Yes." Bell stood there, confused, angry. The confrontation wasn't going the way he'd planned. He'd expected violence, expected Bumpy to respond, to give him the fight he wanted. Instead, nothing. Bell looked around. People were watching, waiting. He had to do something, had to escalate, or he'd look weak. He reached out, knocked Bumpy's drink out of his hand. The glass shattered on the floor. The bar went completely silent. Bumpy looked at the broken glass, then at Bell. That was a waste of good whiskey. Then he turned, walked out of the bar. No hurry, no anger, just left. Bell stood there, everyone staring at him. He'd won, technically. He'd confronted Bumpy Johnson, insulted him, knocked his drink out of his hand, and Bumpy had walked away. But somehow it didn't feel like a victory. 2 weeks later, Marcus Bell was in the hospital. Not because Bumpy had attacked him, not because anyone had attacked him. He'd been jumped by 3 men he didn't know. Random street robbery, the police said. Except it wasn't random. Bell's wallet wasn't taken. His watch wasn't taken. His jewelry wasn't taken. But both his legs were broken, methodically, with tire irons. The attackers had focused on his legs, nothing else, just his legs. Marcus Bell spent 3 months in the hospital, another 6 months learning to walk again. His legs never healed properly. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He never talked about Bumpy Johnson again, and no one ever connected the attack to Bumpy. No evidence, no witnesses, no connection. But everyone understood. That's when people really started to fear Bumpy Johnson. Not because of what he'd done, because of what happened to people who challenged him, without him ever pulling a trigger. September 1931. The pattern was becoming clear. A policy banker named Thomas Wright tried to undercut Stephanie St. Clair's prices. He started offering better odds, higher payouts, trying to pull her customers away. It worked initially. Wright gained customers. His revenue increased. Stephanie's people warned him, told him to stop, told him he was operating in protected territory. Wright ignored the warnings. He was making money. He had momentum. Bumpy went to see Wright personally. Walked into Wright's office, above a barbershop on 137th Street. Midday. Wright was there with 2 of his people, counting money. Lots of it. Bumpy knocked. Wright looked up. "Can I help you?" "You can stop operating in Miss St. Clair's territory." Wright laughed. "This is Harlem. It's everyone's territory." "Not exactly." Wright stood up. His 2 men stood with him. "I don't care who you work for. I'm making money. Customers are happy. I'm not stopping." Bumpy looked around the office, at the money on the desk, at the ledgers, at the 2 men standing next to Wright. "All right." Then he left. Wright looked at his men, smiled. "That's the big bad enforcer? That's who everyone's afraid of?" They laughed. 1 week later, Wright's operation was audited. Not by police, by the IRS, Internal Revenue Service. Federal agents, with warrants, with authority. They seized his records, his bank accounts, his property. Wright was charged with tax evasion. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of unreported income, documented carefully, organized perfectly. Wright spent the next 3 years fighting the charges, spent every dollar he'd made and more on lawyers. He was eventually convicted, served 2 years in federal prison. When he got out, he didn't return to Harlem, moved to Philadelphia, worked a legitimate job, never ran numbers again, and people noticed. Tax evasion, federal charges, the kind of problem that didn't just go away. How did that happen? How did federal agents suddenly have all that evidence? No one could prove anything, but everyone suspected. That's when the whispers really started. Bumpy Johnson had connections. Real connections. Not just street level. Higher than that. Police, federal agents, politicians, people with real power. And he knew how to use those connections. Not obviously, not directly, but effectively. October 1931. Another test. A crew from the Lower East Side decided to rob one of Stephanie's collection points. Bold move, stupid move, but lucrative if it worked. They planned it carefully, watched the location, timed the collections, knew when the most money would be there. They hit the location on a Friday night. 3 men, armed, masked. They got in, got the money, got out. Approximately $8,000, significant amount. Stephanie's people reported it immediately. Bumpy was notified. The crew that did the robbery celebrated. They'd pulled it off, hit a major operation, got away clean. They planned to lie low for a few weeks, then spend the money carefully, not attract attention. That was their plan. 2 days after the robbery, one of the 3 men was found in an alley in the Lower East Side, dead. Single gunshot to the head. The money on him was gone. The next day, the second man disappeared. Just vanished. His apartment was empty. His belongings were gone. No one knew where he went. Some said he ran. Others said he was killed and the body was hidden. Either way, he was gone. The third man, the one who'd planned the robbery, turned himself in to the police. Walked into a precinct. Confessed to the robbery. Returned what money he still had. Approximately $2,000. He was arrested, charged, sentenced to 5 years. He served the full sentence, got out in 1936. When people asked him why he'd turned himself in, why he'd confessed when the police had no evidence, he said, "Because prison was safer." Everyone understood what he meant. Bumpy Johnson hadn't caught them, hadn't interrogated them, hadn't threatened them. But somehow, within 48 hours, one was dead, one was gone, and one was in police custody. That kind of speed, that kind of efficiency, that kind of reach. It was terrifying. By the end of 1931, the pattern was undeniable. People who challenged Bumpy Johnson, who crossed Stephanie St. Clair's operation, who violated the rules, faced consequences. But not the kind of consequences anyone expected. Not gunfights, not beatings, not public violence. Something else. Something worse. Arrests that appeared from nowhere. Suppliers that vanished. Businesses that collapsed. Evidence that shouldn't exist. People who disappeared without explanation. And none of it could be traced back to Bumpy. No witnesses, no evidence, no direct connection. Just a pattern. A clear, undeniable pattern. Cross Bumpy Johnson and your life falls apart. Not immediately, not violently, but inevitably. That was more frightening than any gun, because you couldn't see it coming, couldn't prepare for it, couldn't fight back against it. All you could do was avoid it. And avoiding it meant one thing. Don't cross Bumpy Johnson. By 1932, most people in Harlem had learned that lesson. The ones who hadn't learned it were either gone, dead, or in prison. And Bumpy Johnson, the man who rarely pulled his trigger, had become the most feared enforcer in Harlem. Not through violence, through consequences. By 1932, something had changed in Harlem. The violence hadn't stopped. Territory disputes still happened. Money was still stolen. Debts were still owed. But in areas controlled by Stephanie St. Clair, protected by Bumpy Johnson, things were different. Quieter. People resolved problems before they became problems. Paid debts before they were due. Respected boundaries without needing to be reminded. Not because they were more honest. Not because they'd found religion. Because they were afraid. Afraid of consequences they couldn't predict. Let me show you how reputation became a weapon. How fear, properly managed, became more effective than violence ever was. January 1932. A small-time operator named Eddie Ross owed money to Stephanie's operation. $500. Not a fortune, but enough to matter. The debt was 2 weeks overdue. Normally, this would mean a visit. Someone would come to collect. If Ross couldn't pay, there would be consequences. Physical ones. That's how collection always worked. But Ross had heard the stories about Bumpy Johnson. About what happened to people who didn't pay. On the 15th day, before anyone had come to collect, Ross showed up at Stephanie's office. He had $400. Not the full amount, but everything he had. He explained he'd been short. Business was slow, but he was making it right. He'd pay the remaining $100 within 2 weeks, with interest. He apologized. Profusely. Sincerely. The collector accepted the payment. No threats, no violence, no need. Ross paid the remaining 112 days later, with an extra 25 as interest and apology. This happened more and more. People who owed money showing up to pay before being asked. People who might have considered stealing, deciding it wasn't worth the risk. People who might have challenged territory, choosing to operate somewhere else. Fear was doing the work that violence used to do, more effectively, more efficiently, with fewer complications. March 1932. A numbers runner named Calvin Morris was caught skimming. Not much, maybe $50 over 2 months. Small amounts, easy to hide, except he got caught. His supervisor reported it. The report reached Bumpy. Normally this meant an example. Morris would be beaten. Badly. Publicly. So everyone would know what happened when you stole. Instead, Bumpy called Morris in for a meeting. Morris arrived terrified, convinced he was about to die. Or worse. Bumpy sat him down, offered him coffee. then spoke, calmly. "You've been skimming." Morris tried to deny it. Bumpy held up a hand. "Don't. We both know you did it. The question is, what happens next?" Morris went silent, waiting. "You have two choices. You can return what you took with a penalty of double the amount. You keep your job. This never happened." Morris nodded immediately, relieved. Or we handle this differently. And you know what that means." Morris chose the first option, paid back the 50 he'd stolen, added another 50 as penalty. He kept his job, stayed loyal, never stole again. And more importantly, he told the story. Told everyone how Bumpy Johnson had given him a choice, how he could have been killed, but wasn't. The story spread, and it did something unexpected. It made other runners more loyal, because Bumpy wasn't just feared now. He was seen as fair, brutal when necessary, but fair when possible. That combination, fear and fairness, created loyalty that violence alone never could. April 1932. A new crew arrived in Harlem from Detroit. They were experienced, professional. They'd run successful operations in other cities. They looked at Harlem's numbers rackets, saw opportunity, started making plans to set up their own operation. They did their research, learned who controlled what, learned the names that mattered. Stephanie St. Clair, Bumpy Johnson. They asked around, what should they know? What should they avoid? The answers they got were interesting. People didn't say, Bumpy Johnson will kill you if you compete. They said, strange things happen to people who compete. They said, I wouldn't recommend it. They said, look what happened to Marcus Bell, to Vincent Corso, to Thomas Wright. No threats, no warnings, just observations, facts, things that had happened. The Detroit crew spent a week gathering information, talking to people, piecing together the pattern. Then they left. Went back to Detroit, set up their operation there instead. One of them later said, we could handle a gunfight. We couldn't handle whatever that was. That's reputation as a weapon, not deterring people through demonstrated violence, deterring them through demonstrated consequences, making them choose not to compete. Not because they couldn't win a fight, because they couldn't predict what losing would actually mean. June 1932. A gambling operation on 141st Street was having problems. The owner, Samuel Kane, was being squeezed by a local crew. They wanted a percentage, wanted control. Kane was paying protection to Stephanie's operation, but he wasn't sure that protection would actually work. He'd heard the stories, but stories were stories. When someone was standing in your establishment with a gun, stories didn't help. The crew came back, made demands, gave Kane 48 hours to decide. Kane contacted Stephanie's people, asked what would happen. He got a message back. Don't worry about it. That was all. 3 words. Kane was still worried. 48 hours passed. The crew returned, ready to enforce their demands. They walked into Kane's gambling operation. 5 men, armed, serious. They looked around. The place was open, operating normally. But something was different. At 3 different tables, men were sitting, playing cards, gambling. Men the crew recognized, not as gamblers, as problems. One man was connected to Lucky Luciano's organization. Another was a known associate of a corrupt police captain. The third was someone they couldn't place, but who carried himself like government. Federal, maybe. The crew looked at each other. This wasn't random. This was a message. They left. Didn't make their demands. Didn't threaten Kane. Just left. Kane asked Stephanie's people what had happened. How had those men ended up in his establishment at that exact time? He never got a clear answer. But he never had problems again. That's reputation as a weapon. Not fighting every battle. Making potential enemies decide the battle isn't worth fighting. August 1932. The police were investigating Stephanie St. Clair's operation. Not aggressively, not with warrants, just watching, gathering information. A detective named Robert Morrison was assigned to the case. He was ambitious, wanted to make a big arrest, build his career. Morrison spent weeks building a case, following runners, documenting collections, recording locations. He was close. Maybe another month and he'd have enough for warrants, arrests. Then Morrison received a visitor at his home, late evening. A well-dressed man, calm, polite. The man didn't threaten Morrison, didn't offer a bribe, didn't say anything explicit. He just shared information about other detectives, other cases, problems in the department. Information that suggested Morrison was focusing on the wrong thing, that there were bigger fish, more important targets. The man left. Morrison never got his name. Morrison thought about the visit, about the information, about the implications. He shifted his investigation, started looking at different targets, bigger operations, different neighborhoods. Stephanie St. Clair's operation was never raided. Morrison eventually made his big arrest. Different case, different target, got his promotion, and Bumpy's reputation grew. Not just in the streets, in the police department, in City Hall, in places where it mattered. People understood. Bumpy Johnson had reach, real reach, into places criminals shouldn't have access. And that made him more dangerous than any gun. By the end of 1932, Harlem had changed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but fundamentally. The violence hadn't stopped, but it had decreased, especially in areas Bumpy protected. Because reputation was doing the work violence used to do. People backed down before confrontations happened. Operators chose different territories before boundaries were violated. Debts were paid before collectors had to visit. Problems were resolved before they became violent. Not because people had become better, because they'd become more afraid. Afraid of the man who rarely pulled his trigger. Afraid of consequences they couldn't predict, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. That fear was more powerful than any demonstration of violence ever could be. Because violence has limits. You can only be in one place at a time, can only threaten so many people, can only fight so many battles. But reputation is everywhere, present in every decision, every choice, every moment when someone considers breaking the rules. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone. He didn't need to be the most violent. He needed to be the most unpredictable. Didn't need to win every fight. He needed to make people choose not to fight. Didn't need to be everywhere. He needed people to believe he could be. And by 1932, people believed. Believed that Bumpy Johnson saw everything, knew everything, could reach anyone. Believed that crossing him meant consequences. Guaranteed. Inevitable. That belief became power. And that power controlled Harlem more effectively than an army ever could. By 1933, Dutch Schultz controlled most illegal alcohol distribution in the Bronx and significant portions of Manhattan. He was making approximately $1 million per month. Conservative estimate. He had over 100 men working directly for him, hundreds more in associated operations. He was one of the most powerful criminals in New York, and he wanted Harlem. Not just access, not just a percentage, complete control. The numbers rackets in Harlem were moving approximately $50,000 per day. Every day. That's over $18 million per year. Most of that money was flowing through independent operators. People like Stephanie St. Clair who didn't answer to anyone. Schultz saw that as inefficient, wasteful. He believed he could consolidate those operations, bring them under his control, take a percentage of everything. The math was simple. Even taking 30% of $18 million was over $5 million per year. Worth the effort. Worth the fight if necessary. Schultz had taken over other territories before. He knew how it worked. Apply pressure. Make examples. Show overwhelming force. Eventually, people submit. It had worked in the Bronx, in parts of Manhattan, in every territory he'd entered. He saw no reason why Harlem would be different. He was wrong. But understanding why he was wrong requires understanding who Dutch Schultz was. how he operated, why his methods had worked everywhere else. Arthur Flegenheimer was born in the Bronx in 1901. Poor family. Abusive father who abandoned the family when Arthur was young. He quit school at 14, started working menial jobs, then started committing crimes. Small stuff initially. Theft, burglary, bar fights. He was arrested multiple times as a teenager, served short sentences. Each time came out harder, angrier. By his early 20s, he'd adopted the name Dutch Schultz. Sounded tougher, more Germanic, more intimidating than Arthur Flegenheimer. When Prohibition started in 1920, Schultz saw opportunity. He started small. Beer distribution, a few speakeasies, local neighborhood stuff. But he was ruthless, absolutely ruthless. When competitors tried to move into his territory, he didn't negotiate. He destroyed them, physically, literally. In 1928, a rival bootlegger named Louis Weiss tried to undercut Schultz's prices. Schultz didn't send a message, didn't issue a warning. He went to Weiss's warehouse personally, with 5 men, heavily armed. They didn't just steal the alcohol. They destroyed everything. Smashed barrels, set fires, beat anyone they found. Weiss himself was beaten so severely he lost vision in one eye permanently. Then Schultz went to Weiss's home, where his family lived. He didn't hurt them, but he made it clear he could, at any time. Weiss left New York within a week, never returned. That was Schultz's method. Overwhelming force, public violence, make the cost of resistance so high that surrender is the only rational choice. It worked. By 1930, Schultz controlled most bootlegging in the Bronx. His organization was earning hundreds of thousands per month. But Prohibition was ending. Everyone knew it. The political support wasn't there anymore. Schultz needed to diversify, find income sources that would survive Prohibition's end. He looked at gambling, numbers rackets, policy games, and the largest concentration of those operations was in Harlem. Schultz's first move into Harlem came in early 1931. He sent representatives, well-dressed men, polite, professional. They visited the major operators, made offers. Work with us. We provide protection, access to better suppliers, connections to police and politicians. In exchange, you pay 40% of revenue. The offer sounded reasonable. Generous even by underworld standards. Some operators accepted, figured 60% of revenue under Schultz's protection was better than 100% without it. Others refused, including Queenie St. Clair. She'd built her operation independently, answered to no one. She wasn't interested in giving up 40% to anyone. Schultz sent his representatives back, made the offer again, suggested she reconsider. She refused again. Schultz sent a message, direct, clear. Everyone in Harlem will work with me, or they won't work at all. Stephanie's response was equally direct. Harlem isn't the Bronx. Things work differently here. That's when Schultz decided to apply pressure. His first move was against a smaller operator, a man named Henry Wallace, who ran a policy game on 125th Street. Wallace had refused Schultz's offer, not aggressively, just politely declined. Schultz sent 6 men. They walked into Wallace's primary collection point. Mid-afternoon, customers present. They didn't ask questions, didn't make speeches. They started breaking things, tables, chairs, windows. They beat Wallace's 2 employees, sent them to the hospital. Then they took all the money, everything in the register, everything Wallace had collected that day, approximately $800. They left. No one tried to stop them. The message was clear. This is what happens when you refuse. Wallace closed his operation within a week. Schultz absorbed his territory, his customers, his runners. The takeover was complete. Schultz expected the same pattern to repeat across Harlem, expected other operators to see what happened to Wallace and make the smart choice. Some did. Several smaller operators agreed to Schultz's terms, started paying the percentage. But Queenie St. Clair didn't, and Schultz decided it was time to make another example. February 1933. Schultz sent 8 men to one of Stephanie's main collection points, a social club on 139th Street, the same one Schultz's men had visited in 1931, the same one where Bumpy had been present. But this time, Schultz sent more men, better armed, with explicit instructions. Take over the location, by force if necessary. The 8 men arrived at 7 p.m. The club was full, 50 people or more, music playing, money. This location is under new management, effective immediately. Anyone collecting money works for Dutch Schultz now. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave. He paused, looked around. But if you leave, don't come back. You're done in Harlem. At a table near the back, Bumpy Johnson sat with 3 of Stephanie's collectors. He'd been reviewing the day's receipts. Ordinary business. One of Schultz's men noticed him, walked over. "You're Bumpy Johnson." Not a question, a statement. "I am. We know about you. We know about your reputation. We also know it's mostly talk." Bumpy set down his pencil, looked up. "If that's what you believe?" "Mr. Schultz sent us with a message. Stephanie St. Clair's operation in Harlem is over. She can work for us or she can leave. Those are the only options." "I'll tell her you said so." The man leaned down, closer, menacing. "You don't seem concerned." "Should I be?" "Mr. Schultz has over 100 men. He controls most of New York. He has connections to Tammany Hall, connections to the police commissioner, connections everywhere that matters." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Impressive. You think you can stand against that? You think Stephanie St. Clair can?" "I don't think anything. I work for Miss St. Clair. She makes the decisions." The man straightened up, frustrated by Bumpy's calm. "Tell her she has 1 week. After that, we start taking her locations by force, starting with this one. I'll deliver the message." Schultz's men left, all 8 of them, walking out with the same confidence they'd arrived with. Everyone in the club expected retaliation, expected Bumpy to mobilize forces, expected preparation for war. Instead, Bumpy went back to his receipts. Business as usual. The week passed. Tension built throughout Harlem. People knew what was coming. Dutch Schultz versus Stephanie St. Clair. Violence was inevitable. Some operators started positioning themselves, trying to figure out which side would win, which side to align with. Smart money was on Schultz. He had more men, more resources, more experience in territorial wars. Stephanie had Bumpy Johnson. But one man, no matter how smart, couldn't stand against Schultz's organization. At least that's what people thought. 7 days after Schultz's ultimatum, nothing happened. Schultz's men didn't return to the social club, didn't attack any of Stephanie's locations, didn't do anything. People were confused. Schultz had made a public threat, given a deadline, then nothing. It made him look weak, indecisive. But that wasn't what was happening. What was happening was that Schultz's organization was having problems. Small problems, seemingly unrelated, but constant. On day 8, one of Schultz's primary warehouses was raided. Police. They found 500 cases of illegal alcohol, evidence of tax evasion. 3 of Schultz's men were arrested. On day 9, Schultz lost a major supplier. The supplier claimed transport problems, equipment failures, couldn't deliver for at least a month. On day 10, a judge who'd been friendly to Schultz's organization suddenly wasn't. Cases that had been dismissed were refiled. Warrants that had been denied were approved. On day 11, Schultz received information. Anonymous. Detailed. Information about police raids being planned on 5 of his locations. Dates, times, what the police were looking for. The information was accurate. All 5 raids happened exactly as described. Schultz lost significant product. More men were arrested. On day 12, Schultz's accountant disappeared. Just vanished. Took some records with him. Not all, just enough to be problematic. On day 13, a newspaper ran a story. Front page. About organized crime in the Bronx. Named Dutch Schultz specifically. Detailed his operations, his income, his methods. The story was accurate. Too accurate. based on inside information. By day 14, Schultz's organization was in chaos. Arrests, raids, lost suppliers, media attention, problems cascading faster than he could address them, and he couldn't figure out where it was coming from. No one had attacked him. No violence, no confrontations. Just problems. Multiplying. Accelerating. Schultz called a meeting with his top lieutenants. Tried to figure out what was happening. One of them suggested it might be Bumpy Johnson. Schultz dismissed it. One man couldn't do this. Couldn't cause this many problems simultaneously. But the problems continued. And slowly, Schultz started to realize something. He couldn't fight this. Couldn't retaliate against it. Because there was nothing to retaliate against. No one to shoot. No territory to raid. No rival organization to attack. Just complications. Appearing from nowhere. Without pattern. Without warning. March 1933. Schultz decided to try a different approach. He requested a meeting with Stephanie St. Clair. Direct. Face to face. Stephanie agreed. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location. A restaurant in Midtown. Public. Safe. Schultz arrived with 2 bodyguards. Stephanie arrived with Bumpy. They sat at a corner table, away from other diners. Schultz spoke first. "I came to make peace." Stephanie raised an eyebrow. "Peace suggests there's been war." "There hasn't. That's what I want to keep it that way." "You issued an ultimatum, threatened my operation." "I did. I was wrong to do that." Bumpy sat silently, watching. Listening. Schultz continued. "I underestimated the situation. I thought Harlem would be like other territories. It's not." "No, it's not. I'm proposing a different arrangement. I stay out of your territory. You stay out of mine. We operate independently. No conflict." Stephanie considered this. "And the operators who've already joined your organization? The ones you took over? They stay with me, but I won't take any more. Your operation remains intact." "That's generous." Schultz smiled. Thin smile, not friendly. "It's practical. The last month has been expensive. I've lost product, lost men, lost money. Someone is causing me significant problems." He looked at Bumpy when he said this. "I can't prove who, but I have suspicions." Bumpy's expression didn't change. Schultz looked back at Stephanie. "I could escalate, bring more men, more resources, make this a real war." "You could, but wars are expensive, unpredictable, and right now, I have other problems that require my attention." "So you're backing down?" Schultz's jaw tightened. He didn't like that phrasing. "I'm choosing my battles. This battle isn't worth the cost." Stephanie nodded slowly. "I accept your terms. You stay out of Harlem. I stay out of the Bronx and your Manhattan territories. We operate independently." They shook hands. Brief. Formal. Schultz stood to leave. Paused. Looked at Bumpy directly. "You're smarter than I expected." Bumpy responded quietly. "I'm exactly as smart as I need to be." Schultz left. His bodyguards followed. Stephanie and Bumpy remained seated. "That was easier than expected," Stephanie said. "He didn't have a choice." "Will he honor the agreement?" "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because breaking it would be more expensive than keeping it." Schultz never moved against Stephanie's operation again. Never tried to take over Harlem's numbers rackets. He kept his word. Not because he'd suddenly become honorable. Because he'd learned something. He'd learned that his methods, his violence, his overwhelming force didn't work everywhere. Didn't work against an opponent who fought differently. Who didn't meet force with force. Who didn't respond to threats with threats. Who fought with complications. With consequences. With problems that multiplied faster than they could be addressed. Schultz was used to wars he could win through violence. Through having more men. More guns. More willingness to kill. But this wasn't that kind of war. This was something he couldn't fight. Couldn't even properly identify. And that made it unwinnable. The story of Dutch Schultz and Bumpy Johnson spread throughout the criminal underworld. Not just in Harlem, throughout New York, throughout the country. Word traveled. the most violent gangster in New York, had backed down from Harlem. Not because he'd been beaten in a gunfight, not because his operation had been destroyed, because he'd been outmaneuvered, frustrated, made to realize that winning would cost more than it was worth by someone who'd never fired a shot. People started to understand what Bumpy Johnson had figured out, that in a world where everyone expects violence, where everyone's prepared for violence, violence becomes predictable. And predictable means defeatable. But unpredictability, consequences that come from unexpected directions, problems that multiply without clear sources, that's terrifying. That's unbeatable. Because you can't prepare for what you can't predict. Can't defend against what you can't identify. Can't fight what isn't there to fight. Dutch Schultz's story ended in October 1935. He was shot to death in a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey, killed by rivals. The hit was ordered by the National Crime Syndicate, Lucky Luciano's organization. Schultz had become a liability, too violent, too public, attracting too much law enforcement attention. The decision was made to eliminate him. 4 men walked into the restaurant where Schultz was having dinner, shot him and 3 of his associates. Schultz died the next day in the hospital. He was 33 years old. His death wasn't related to his conflict with Stephanie St. Clair or Bumpy Johnson. That conflict had been resolved 2 years earlier. But there's an interesting detail. After Schultz's death, his Harlem operations fell apart. The operators he'd taken over in Harlem, the territory he'd claimed, it all dissolved within months. Some of those operators went independent again. Some joined other organizations. Many ended up working with Stephanie St. Clair. She absorbed most of the territory Schultz had controlled, not through violence, through offering better terms, better protection, better management. By 1936, Stephanie St. Clair controlled more of Harlem's numbers racket than ever before, and Bumpy Johnson's reputation had grown exponentially. He was the man who'd stood up to Dutch Schultz, the most feared gangster in New York, and won, without pulling his trigger. The Dutch Schultz chapter taught Harlem something important. It taught them that violence wasn't the only form of power. Sometimes it wasn't even the most effective form. That reputation, properly built and properly used, could defeat any amount of force. That fear of the unknown was more powerful than fear of the known. Dutch Schultz represented the old way, the way everyone understood. Violence, force, intimidation through demonstrated brutality. Bumpy Johnson represented something new, something most criminals hadn't considered. Power through restraint, control through unpredictability, victory through making enemies choose not to fight. Schultz was more violent than Bumpy, had more men, more money, more resources. But Bumpy was more effective because he understood something Schultz never did. That in a war where everyone expects bullets, the most dangerous weapon is the one they never see coming. Years later, after both men were gone, people still told the story. Still talked about how Dutch Schultz, the man who'd shot someone in a crowded restaurant, who'd built an empire on public brutality, who'd never backed down from anyone, had walked away from Harlem. Had sat across from Bumpy Johnson and chosen peace. Not because he'd been beaten, because he couldn't figure out how to win. That's the power of reputation. That's the power of restraint. That's what happens when the most feared man is the one who rarely pulls the trigger. By 1934, Bumpy Johnson had been operating in Harlem for 4 years. In that time, he'd been arrested twice. Minor charges both times. Possession of a concealed weapon, disorderly conduct. He'd served no significant jail time since his release from Sing Sing in 1928. This was unusual, almost unprecedented for someone in his position. Most high-level enforcers in the criminal underworld were arrested regularly, spent significant time in prison. It was considered part of the job. Dutch Schultz had been arrested 17 times by 1934. Lucky Luciano had been arrested over a dozen times. Bumpy Johnson? Twice. For minor offenses. This created a problem for law enforcement. They knew who Bumpy was, knew what he did, knew he was a central figure in Harlem's organized crime. But they couldn't build a case against him. Because Bumpy Johnson was rarely present when crimes occurred, rarely connected directly to illegal activity, and that was intentional. Let me explain how law enforcement tried to handle Bumpy Johnson, and why they consistently failed. The NYPD had a special unit dedicated to organized crime in Harlem, approximately 20 detectives. Their job was to investigate and arrest major operators. By 1933, they'd identified Stephanie St. Clair as a primary target. They knew she ran the largest numbers operation in Harlem. They knew Bumpy Johnson worked for her. They started surveillance, following him, documenting his movements. Detective James Murphy was assigned to lead the investigation. Murphy was experienced. 15 years with the NYPD, multiple successful organized crime cases. He knew how these investigations worked. You follow the enforcer, document who they meet with, where they go, what money changes hands. You build a pattern, connect the individual to the organization. Then you make arrests. Murphy followed Bumpy for 3 months, January through March 1933. He documented everything: where Bumpy ate breakfast, what clubs he visited, who he spoke with. But he never saw Bumpy commit a crime. Never saw him collect money. Never saw him threaten anyone. Never saw him with weapons or drugs or anything illegal. Bumpy walked around Harlem like a civilian, stopped in shops, ate at restaurants, attended church on Sundays. He met with people, conversations on street corners, in parks, in public places. But Murphy couldn't hear what was being said, and nothing appeared to change hands. Murphy was frustrated. He knew Bumpy was involved. Everyone knew, but he couldn't prove it. He reported this to his supervisor, asked for more resources, more detectives, better surveillance. His supervisor approved. 4 additional detectives were assigned. Now 5 detectives were following Bumpy Johnson. Rotating shifts, 24-hour surveillance. This continued for another 2 months, April and May 1933. Same result, no observable criminal activity. But Murphy noticed something else, something that made the situation more complicated. Bumpy seemed to know he was being followed, not just suspected, knew. He never looked directly at the detectives, never acknowledged them, but his behavior suggested awareness. He took routes that made surveillance difficult: crowded streets, multiple turns, frequent stops. He had conversations in locations where the detectives couldn't get close enough to hear. He never did anything that looked like criminal activity when surveillance was present. Murphy realized Bumpy was playing a game, making the surveillance obvious to everyone except making it useless. In June 1933, Murphy tried a different approach. Instead of following Bumpy, he focused on the people Bumpy met with. If he couldn't catch Bumpy in the act, maybe he could catch the people Bumpy worked with, then build a case backward. Murphy identified 12 regular associates, people Bumpy met with frequently. He investigated each one. Backgrounds, criminal records, known activities. Most were low-level operators, numbers runners, small-time criminals. Murphy started making arrests, bringing people in for questioning. Standard procedure: pressure the small fish, get them to talk about the big fish. The first arrest was a numbers runner named David Washington. Washington was caught with $300 in small bills, clear evidence of numbers running. Murphy brought him in, offered a deal, information about Bumpy Johnson in exchange for reduced charges. Washington refused, wouldn't say anything. Murphy tried harder, explained Washington was looking at serious time. That cooperation could make it easier. Washington still refused. "I don't know anything," he said. Murphy pressed. "You meet with Bumpy Johnson regularly. We've documented it. You work for Stephanie St. Clair's operation. Tell us how it works. Who gives orders? How money flows?" Washington was silent. Murphy got frustrated. "You're protecting someone who won't protect you. You're going to prison. For what? Loyalty to a criminal organization?" Washington finally spoke. "I run numbers. That's all I do. I don't know anything about any organization." He was convicted, served 8 months, never provided any information. Murphy tried this approach with 4 more arrests. Same result. No one would talk about Bumpy Johnson. No one would provide information about how the organization worked. Not because they'd been threatened. At least, not with violence. When Murphy asked why they wouldn't cooperate, the answers were vague. I don't know anything. I work alone. I can't help you. Murphy realized something. These people weren't afraid of what Bumpy would do to them if they talked. They were afraid of what would happen to them in ways they couldn't see or predict. The same fear that kept civilians quiet was keeping criminals quiet. In August 1933, Murphy tried a different strategy. He attempted to flip someone closer to Bumpy. Someone with direct access, a collector named Raymond Hughes. Hughes had been working for Stephanie's operation for 3 years, collected money from multiple locations, met with Bumpy regularly. Murphy had evidence. Hughes had been caught with $2,000 in cash. Clear numbers operation money. The charges were serious. Hughes was looking at 5 years. Murphy offered a deal. Full immunity, protection, relocation if necessary. All Hughes had to do was testify, explain how the operation worked, identify who gave orders, where money went. Hughes considered it, asked for time to think. Murphy gave him 48 hours. 2 days later, Hughes returned, refused the deal. Murphy was shocked. You're looking at 5 years in prison. You have a family. I'm offering you a way out. Hughes shook his head. I'll take the prison time. Why? What are you afraid of? Hughes was quiet for a long moment, then said, I'm not afraid. I just don't know anything worth testifying about. He was convicted, served 4 years, never cooperated. Murphy later learned something interesting. While Hughes was in prison, his family was taken care of. His wife received money every month, enough to live on, to pay rent, to feed their children. No one claimed credit. The money just appeared, regularly, reliably. When Hughes was released, he had a job waiting, legitimate work, better pay than numbers running. Murphy realized what was happening. Bumpy Johnson wasn't threatening people into silence. He was taking care of them, providing for their families while they were in prison, making sure loyalty was rewarded. It was more effective than threats, because threats create resentment, create motivation to betray. But support, taking care of people's families, that creates actual loyalty, the kind of loyalty that doesn't break under pressure. By late 1933, Murphy's investigation had stalled completely. Multiple arrests, no cooperation, no information, no case against Bumpy Johnson. Murphy's supervisor pulled him aside, told him to move on to other targets. We know he's dirty, the supervisor said, but if we can't prove it, we can't prosecute it. Focus on people we can actually catch. Murphy was frustrated, but understood. Resources were limited. He had other cases. But he remained curious. How did Bumpy Johnson operate? How did he avoid leaving evidence? Murphy spent his free time studying Bumpy's pattern. Not for an official investigation. Just personal curiosity. He realized something. Bumpy was never present when crimes occurred. Money was collected by runners, transferred by couriers, processed by accountants. Bumpy met with people, had conversations, gave what might be instructions. But those conversations happened in public, without witnesses close enough to hear, without documentation. If someone got arrested, Bumpy's name might come up. But there was never direct evidence connecting him to specific crimes. He was insulated, deliberately, carefully, multiple layers between him and illegal activity. Murphy also noticed something else. Bumpy had relationships with people in legitimate positions. He knew police officers, not corrupt ones, regular patrol officers. He'd helped their families at some point, a child's hospital bill, a wife's medical expenses. Nothing illegal, just generosity, making connections. Those officers weren't on his payroll, weren't corrupt, but they remembered the help. And when information circulated through the department, when operations were being planned, those officers sometimes mentioned things to friends, to people who mentioned things to other people. And information, through that chain, sometimes reached Bumpy. Not directly, never directly, but effectively. Murphy realized Bumpy had built a network, not through bribery, through relationships, through helping people when they needed help. And those relationships provided information, protection, warning. It was subtle, almost invisible, and nearly impossible to prosecute. In 1934, the FBI became interested in organized crime in Harlem. Federal investigation, more resources, more authority. An agent named William Foster was assigned to build a case. Foster was good, Harvard-educated, meticulous, successful track record. He reviewed Murphy's files, studied the pattern, understood the challenge. Foster decided on a different approach: financial investigation. If he couldn't catch Bumpy committing crimes, he'd catch him on tax evasion. It had worked against Al Capone, should work against Bumpy Johnson. Foster subpoenaed financial records, bank accounts, property records, tax returns. What he found was interesting. Bumpy Johnson had no significant assets, no property in his name, no large bank accounts, no obvious wealth. He lived in a modest apartment in Harlem, rented, nothing fancy. He had no car registered to his name, no investments, no hidden accounts that Foster could find. His reported income was minimal, occasional legitimate work, just enough to live on. Foster was confused. Everyone knew Bumpy worked for a major criminal organization. Where was the money? Foster expanded the investigation, looked at Bumpy's family, his associates. Same result. No obvious wealth, no large accounts, nothing suspicious. Foster started to realize something. Either Bumpy Johnson was somehow operating without making money, which made no sense, or he was keeping money in ways that left no paper trail, cash, hidden, never deposited, never recorded. That made prosecution difficult, because without records, there was no evidence. Foster tried another approach: surveillance of financial transactions. He monitored banks where he suspected money might be laundered, watched for patterns. He found some irregular activity: cash deposits, multiple accounts, frequent transactions. But he couldn't connect them definitively to Bumpy Johnson. The money moved through multiple hands, multiple locations. By the time Foster traced it, the connection to Bumpy was tenuous, circumstantial. Not enough for a case. Foster spent 8 months on this investigation, 1934 into early 1935. Eventually, his supervisor told him the same thing Murphy's supervisor had said. "We know he's dirty, but if we can't prove it, we can't prosecute it. Move on." Foster filed his report, noted that Bumpy Johnson was likely involved in organized crime, but that building a prosecutable case appeared impossible with current evidence. The file was closed. This pattern repeated multiple times over the 1930s. Different agencies, different investigators, same result. Everyone knew Bumpy Johnson was a major figure in Harlem's criminal underworld, but no one could build a case that would hold up in court. He was, effectively, untouchable. Not because he'd corrupted the system, not because he'd bought off enough people, because he operated in ways that left no evidence. Multiple layers of insulation, conversations with no witnesses, transactions with no records. Help for people that created loyalty without requiring criminal activity. Information networks that functioned through legitimate relationships. It was sophisticated, more sophisticated than most criminal organizations. And it frustrated law enforcement for years. That in a world where everyone expects violence, where everyone's prepared for violence, violence becomes predictable. And predictable means defeatable. But unpredictability, consequences that come from unexpected directions, problems that multiply without clear sources, that's terrifying. That's unbeatable. Because you can't prepare for what you can't predict, can't defend against what you can't identify, can't fight what isn't there to fight. The first documented incident happened in April 1934. A man named Thomas Hewitt arrived in Harlem from Chicago. Hewitt was an enforcer, professional, experienced. He'd worked for Al Capone's organization, had a reputation for extreme violence. Hewitt came to New York for a specific job. He'd been hired to kill someone. The target was a low-level numbers runner named Samuel Green. Green had stolen from his employer, A significant amount, $5,000. The employer wanted Green dead, publicly, as an example. They hired Hewitt because he was known for making statements, for violence that people remembered. Hewitt arrived in Harlem in early April, spent a week locating Green, learning his patterns, planning the hit. The problem was that Green worked for Stephanie St. Clair's operation, and Stephanie's operation was protected by Bumpy Johnson. When Hewitt was spotted asking questions about Green, when people realized what he was planning, word reached Bumpy. Bumpy sent a message. Simple, direct. Samuel Green is protected. Leave Harlem. Hewitt ignored the message. He'd been paid. He had a reputation to maintain. He wasn't going to be scared off by threats. On April 18th, Hewitt made his move. He found Green leaving a social club on 133rd Street. Around midnight, Green was alone, walking home. Hewitt approached him from behind, gun drawn. He never fired, because Bumpy was there, waiting, not alone, with two men. Hewitt saw them, realized the situation, tried to react. Too late. What happened next was quick, brutal, efficient. Hewitt was disarmed, beaten, not killed, but severely injured. Broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, facial fractures. Then he was put in a car, driven to the train station, purchased a one-way ticket to Chicago, and told, if you come back to New York, you won't leave. Hewitt took the train, left New York that night. He never returned, never completed the contract, never spoke about what happened. But the story spread anyway. This incident was significant for several reasons. First, it showed that Bumpy could be violent when necessary, that the restraint was a choice, not a limitation. Second, it showed discrimination. Bumpy didn't kill Hewitt. Could have. Would have been justified in that world. But he chose measured violence. Just enough to remove the threat. Not more. Third, it sent a message to anyone considering similar actions. Stephanie's people were protected. Attempting to harm them would result in immediate, personal consequences. The story reinforced Bumpy's reputation, but in a specific way. It didn't make him seem randomly violent. It made him seem controlled, precise, someone who used violence as a tool, not as a default. That was more frightening than constant violence, because it suggested calculation, planning, control. The second major incident happened in September 1935. A crew from Philadelphia decided to rob one of Stephanie's main collection points. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to rob a collection point. It had happened before. Previous robberies had been handled the way Bumpy usually handled problems. Quietly, without direct violence. The robbers would be identified. Their lives would become complicated. They'd return the money or face escalating consequences. But this Philadelphia crew was different. They were professionals, organized, serious, and they'd done their research. They knew about Bumpy Johnson, knew about his reputation. They'd planned for it. The robbery happened on September 23rd, Tuesday evening, peak collection time. 4 men, heavily armed, masked, professional equipment. They entered the collection point, a social club on 141st Street. About 30 people present. They controlled the room immediately, showed their weapons, made it clear this wasn't amateur work. They collected the money, approximately $12,000, significant amount. Then they did something different from previous robberies. They identified one of Stephanie's collectors, a man named Raymond Foster. They took him with them, hostage. The plan was sophisticated. If anyone tried to follow, if anyone tried to retaliate, Foster would be killed. They'd hold him for 3 days, then release him. By that time, they'd be back in Philadelphia. Money laundered. Safe. It was a smart plan. It accounted for Bumpy's usual methods. The quiet retaliation, the delayed consequences. Hard to cause problems for people you can't identify, and they'd be gone before identification was possible. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated how quickly Bumpy could act when he chose to. The robbery happened at 8 p.m. By 9 p.m., Bumpy had been notified. By 10 p.m., he'd identified the crew, Philadelphia connections, known criminals, names, associates. By midnight, he knew where they were holding Foster, an abandoned warehouse in South Philadelphia. By 2 a.m., Bumpy was there, with 4 men, armed, ready. What happened next was never fully documented. No police report, no official record, but the result was clear. 3 of the 4 Philadelphia crew members were killed, shot, professional execution. The 4th member was left alive, deliberately, to carry a message back. Raymond Foster was recovered, unharmed. The money was returned, all $12,000, and the message delivered to Philadelphia was clear. Stealing from Harlem has consequences, immediate, final, non-negotiable. This incident changed something in Bumpy's reputation. Before this, people understood he was dangerous, but the danger was abstract, indirect, complicated. This was different. This was direct violence, fast, decisive, lethal. It showed that when Bumpy's usual methods wouldn't work, when the situation required immediate action, he could be as violent as anyone. More violent, actually, because his violence was focused, efficient, without hesitation. The restraint people had seen for years wasn't moral, it was strategic. And when strategy required violence, violence happened. Quickly, effectively. Word spread throughout the criminal underworld, not just in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston. The story was repeated, embellished, the details varied, but the core message was consistent. Don't mistake restraint for weakness. The 3rd major incident happened in March 1936. This one was personal. A man named Victor Kane had been operating in Harlem for several years. Small-time hustler, ran scams, cheated people, nothing major. Bumpy had warned him before, told him to operate more honestly, told him that preying on Harlem residents would create problems. Kane had backed off temporarily, then returned to his old patterns. In March 1936, Kane scammed an elderly woman, took her life savings, $800, everything she had. The woman's name was Dorothy Johnson, Bumpy's mother. Kane hadn't known. He'd chosen her randomly, seen an elderly woman who seemed vulnerable, ran his con, took her money, disappeared. When Bumpy found out, his response was different from anything people had seen before. He didn't send messages, didn't issue warnings, didn't use his usual methods. He went looking for Kane himself, personally. It took him 3 days to find him. Kane was hiding, had heard what happened, knew he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Bumpy found him in a boarding house in the Bronx. What happened in that room was never witnessed. No one was present. But Victor Kane was found the next morning, dead. Single gunshot to the head. The money was gone, presumably returned to Dorothy Johnson. The police investigated. Briefly, it was a clear execution, but Kane was a known criminal. The investigation went nowhere. Bumpy was never questioned, never charged, never connected officially to the death, but everyone knew. And this incident did something unique to Bumpy's reputation. It showed that behind the restraint, behind the calculated strategy, behind the intelligence and the patience, there was something else. Something primal. Something that couldn't be negotiated with or manipulated. Hurt Bumpy's family, and restraint disappeared entirely. That added a different dimension to his reputation, made it more human, more relatable. People understood business violence, territory disputes, money conflicts. But family? Everyone understood that. Everyone recognized that boundary. And everyone understood that crossing it meant death. Immediate, personal, guaranteed. The 4th major incident happened in August 1937. A corrupt police officer named Daniel McCarthy had been shaking down businesses in Harlem. Not unusual. Corruption was common. Most businesses paid small amounts to officers regularly, part of doing business. But McCarthy was excessive, demanding large payments, threatening businesses that couldn't pay. Several of those businesses were paying protection to Stephanie's operation, which meant they were paying twice. Once to McCarthy, once to Stephanie. Some businesses couldn't afford both. They came to Bumpy's attention. Bumpy tried his usual approach, made calls, applied pressure through channels. McCarthy had protection. His precinct captain was covering for him. He felt untouchable. He told one business owner, "I don't care who you pay protection to. You pay me or I shut you down." When that got back to Bumpy, he made a decision. McCarthy needed to be handled, but killing a police officer would bring enormous attention. Federal investigation, massive pressure. Not worth it. Bumpy chose a different approach. He gathered evidence, documented McCarthy's corruption, dates, times, amounts, witnesses, but not for a police report. McCarthy's captain would bury it. Instead, Bumpy sent the evidence to a reporter, a journalist who'd been investigating police corruption in Harlem. The reporter, Elizabeth Carter, had been working on this story for months, but she lacked concrete evidence. Most people were too afraid to go on record. Bumpy gave her everything she needed: names, dates, documentation, witnesses willing to testify if their identities were protected. The story ran in September 1937. Front page, multiple articles, detailed investigation. McCarthy was exposed. His corruption was public, undeniable. The police department had to act. Couldn't ignore a front page scandal. McCarthy was arrested, charged, convicted, sentenced to 5 years in prison. But that wasn't the end. In prison, McCarthy had problems. Constant problems. Fights, enemies, threats. He served his full sentence in fear, in isolation, in constant danger. When he was released in 1942, he left New York immediately, never returned. This incident was different from the others. No direct violence, but the outcome was the same. McCarthy's life was destroyed, completely, permanently, and it sent a message to other corrupt officers. You can take small payments, operate within reasonable limits, but excessive greed, hurting Bumpy's people, crossing the line, that would be handled. Not with violence necessarily, but handled, effectively. The distinction was important. Bumpy wasn't anti-police, wasn't at war with law enforcement. He was anti-corruption, anti-excess, anti-people who abused power. That nuance mattered. It kept relationships functional with honest police officers, maintained a complex balance. These 4 incidents, spread across several years, defined the boundaries of Bumpy's restraint. They showed when violence happened, when the usual methods weren't sufficient, when immediate action was necessary. But more importantly, they showed that violence was a choice, a tool, not a default state. Most criminals used violence constantly. It was their primary language, their first response to any problem. Bumpy used violence rarely, which made each instance more significant, more memorable, more effective. When violence came from someone known for restraint, it carried more weight. It wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, necessary, final, and that made it terrifying. Years later, people who knew Bumpy talked about these incidents. They said you could see it coming, not always when, but if. Bumpy's usual demeanor was calm, controlled, patient. But when a line was crossed, when someone pushed too far, something changed. The calm remained, but it became different, colder, more certain. And people who'd been around him long enough recognized that change, recognized that restraint was about to end. And they made sure to be somewhere else when it did, because Bumpy Johnson's violence, when it came, was absolute. Not excessive, not theatrical, just complete. The problem would be removed, permanently, efficiently, and then restraint would return, like nothing had happened. That ability to switch, to go from patient strategist to immediate executor, and back again, that was what made him truly dangerous. Because you never knew which version you were dealing with. Never knew if a conversation was just a conversation or a final warning. Never knew if walking away was the end or the beginning. That uncertainty, that unpredictability, that was the real weapon. Violence was just the enforcement mechanism, the tool used when all other tools had failed. But the fact that it existed, that it was available, that it could be deployed at any moment, that shaped every interaction, every negotiation, every confrontation, every decision. People knew that behind the restraint was capability, behind the patience was power, behind the calm was violence. And knowing that changed everything. By 1938, Bumpy Johnson's reputation was complete. He was known for restraint, for intelligence, for solving problems without violence. But he was also known as someone who could be violent when necessary, who had been violent, who would be again if circumstances required. That combination, restraint backed by demonstrated capability, was more powerful than either quality alone. Restraint without capability is weakness. Violence without restraint is chaos. But restraint with proven capability, that's power. Real power. The kind that doesn't need to be demonstrated constantly, because everyone already knows it exists. That's what Bumpy Johnson achieved. That's what made him different. That's why he controlled Harlem for decades, while more violent criminals died young. Because he understood something most criminals never learned. That violence is a tool, a last resort, not a way of life. And the less you use it, the more effective it becomes. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968. He was 62 years old. He collapsed from a heart attack in a restaurant in Harlem. Wells Restaurant, a place he'd been going to for decades, eating with a friend. Ordinary evening. Then he was gone. The funeral was held at St. Martin's Episcopal Church on Lenox Avenue. Over 1,000 people attended. Standing room only. People lined the streets outside. Politicians came, community leaders, business owners, regular people from Harlem. Some came because they knew him personally. Others because they knew his reputation. Others because they wanted to be seen paying respects. The service was dignified, respectful, no glorification of criminal activity, just recognition of a man who'd been significant in Harlem for nearly 40 years. After his death, people expected a power vacuum, expected violence, expected multiple people trying to take over the territory he'd controlled. That's what always happened when major criminal figures died. Wars for succession, blood in the streets. It didn't happen. Several factors contributed to this. By 1968, the criminal landscape in Harlem had changed. The numbers rackets weren't as profitable. Heroin had become the dominant business. But there was another factor, Bumpy's legacy. The way he'd operated, the reputation he'd built, the methods he'd used. They'd changed how power worked in Harlem? Let me explain what I mean. Before Bumpy Johnson, power in Harlem's criminal underworld was straightforward. The most violent person, the person with the most muscle, the person willing to kill the most people. That person controlled territory. It was simple, brutal, effective, but temporary. Because someone younger, hungrier, more violent would always eventually challenge. And the cycle would continue. Violence created more violence. Leadership changed constantly. Stability was impossible. Bumpy demonstrated a different model. He showed that power could be built on intelligence, on strategy, on relationships, on consequences that came from unexpected directions. He showed that violence was a tool, not a foundation, and he lasted decades, not years, decades. That model influenced a generation of criminals in Harlem. Not all of them. Some continued operating the old way. Violence first. Strategy, never. Those people died young or ended up in prison. But the ones who studied Bumpy's methods, who understood what he'd figured out, they lasted longer. They built more stable operations, had fewer confrontations with law enforcement, maintained power more consistently. The most successful criminal operators in Harlem in the 1970s and 1980s, several of them cited Bumpy Johnson as an influence. Not because he taught them how to kill, because he taught them when not to. Frank Lucas is a notable example. Lucas was a major heroin dealer in Harlem in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was arrested in 1975. His operation had been moving over $1 million per day at its peak. In interviews years later, Lucas talked about Bumpy Johnson. They'd known each other. Lucas had worked as one of Bumpy's drivers in the 1960s. Lucas said Bumpy taught him the most important lesson he ever learned in the drug trade. Don't be flashy. Don't draw attention. Don't make yourself a target. Lucas violated that advice later in his career. Bought expensive cars, wore fur coats, made himself visible. And that visibility contributed to his downfall, made him a target for law enforcement, made his operation obvious. But the lesson had come from Bumpy. The understanding that in an illegal business, invisibility is protection. Lucas also talked about how Bumpy handled conflicts, how he resolved problems without immediately resorting to violence. Bumpy would talk to people, explain things, give them chances. Violence was always the last option, not the first. Lucas said that made Bumpy's organization more stable. Less turnover, fewer bodies, less police attention. The guys who killed everyone, they got arrested or killed themselves within a few years. Bumpy lasted 40 years. Nicky Barnes was another major drug dealer in Harlem in the 1970s. He led an organization called the Council. Barnes was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison. While in prison, he became a government informant, testified against his former associates. In those testimonies, Barnes talked about Harlem's criminal history, about the people who'd come before him. He mentioned Bumpy Johnson specifically, said Bumpy's reputation was still active in the 1970s, years after his death. People still talked about Bumpy like he might come back, like his ghost was still watching. Barnes said this wasn't superstition, it was respect, recognition that Bumpy had operated at a different level. Most gangsters, when they die, people forget them in a year. Bumpy died, and people talked about him for decades. Barnes noted that Bumpy's methods, his restraint, his strategic thinking, those lessons were still being passed down. Young guys coming up, older guys would tell them, "Don't be stupid. Think before you act. Remember what Bumpy did." Not all of them listened. Barnes himself was known for being flashy, for violence, for making himself visible. And like Lucas, that contributed to his downfall. But the fact that Bumpy's name was still being invoked, still being used as an example, years after his death, that was significant. It showed that his legacy wasn't just about what he'd done. It was about what he'd proven possible. Leroy Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas were both eventually imprisoned. Their organizations collapsed. The heroin trade in Harlem became more violent, more chaotic throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Bodies piled up. Young men died constantly. Neighborhoods were devastated. Some people who'd known Bumpy talked about this, about how different things had become. A former associate, speaking anonymously in the 1980s, said, "Bumpy kept things controlled, kept violence minimal, kept the streets functioning. When he died, when everyone forgot his lessons, everything fell apart." This might be romanticizing the past. Bumpy's era wasn't peaceful. Crime was still crime. Violence still happened. But there was a difference in scale, in frequency, in randomness. Bumpy's violence was targeted, specific, purposeful. The violence that came later was indiscriminate, constant, destructive to entire communities. The restraint he'd demonstrated, the intelligence he'd employed, those qualities disappeared from Harlem's criminal underworld, and Harlem suffered for it. Law enforcement also remembered Bumpy Johnson. Retired detectives, years later, would still talk about him, about the investigations that went nowhere, the cases that couldn't be built. Detective James Murphy, who'd investigated Bumpy in the 1930s, retired in 1955. Before his death in 1972, he gave an interview to a police history project. He was asked about the criminals he'd investigated over his career. Who was most memorable? Who was most difficult? He talked about Bumpy Johnson. "Smartest criminal I ever dealt with, and I dealt with hundreds. Bumpy was different. He understood the system better than most criminals understand their own operations." Murphy talked about the frustration of investigating someone so careful, someone who left no evidence. "We knew what he was doing. Everyone knew. But knowing and proving are different things. Bumpy understood that distinction. Used it. Murphy said it changed how he approached investigations afterward, made him think more strategically. Bumpy taught me that intelligence is more dangerous than violence, that the criminals to really worry about aren't the ones making noise. They're the ones you can't hear. Other investigators said similar things, that Bumpy had been uniquely challenging, that he'd operated at a level most criminals never reached, and that dealing with him had made them better at their jobs, because he forced them to think harder, work smarter. That's a strange legacy, being respected by the people whose job was to arrest you. But it speaks to Bumpy's approach. He wasn't at war with law enforcement. He was operating within a system, understanding its rules, working around them. That created a different kind of relationship, professional rather than personal, strategic rather than hostile. Harlem itself remembered Bumpy Johnson. Not officially. There are no monuments, no plaques, no streets named after him. But in conversation, in stories passed down, in the collective memory of the community. Older residents, people who'd lived in Harlem in the 1930s through 1960s, they remembered. Some remembered him as a criminal, part of the problem, part of what made Harlem difficult. Others remembered him differently, as someone who'd helped people, who'd provided jobs when legal employment wasn't available, who'd protected the community from worse elements. The truth was, probably both. Complicated, not easily categorized. But the consistency in these memories is interesting. People remembered his intelligence, his restraint, his fairness. They remembered that he was feared, but also respected. That he was violent when necessary, but not randomly violent. One elderly woman, interviewed in 1995 about Harlem's history, talked about Bumpy. You could walk the streets at night. Back then, even with all the numbers running, all the illegal business, you felt safer, because Bumpy didn't allow random violence, didn't allow people preying on regular folks. She paused, then added, when he died, when things changed, it got worse, much worse. Maybe we didn't appreciate what we had until it was gone. This might be selective memory, nostalgia making the past better than it was. But multiple people said similar things, that despite his criminal activities, Bumpy had maintained a kind of order, a structure, rules that everyone understood. And when that disappeared, when structure gave way to chaos, communities suffered. Bumpy Johnson's methods, his approach to power, his understanding of fear and restraint, these concepts extended beyond his life, beyond Harlem, beyond criminal activity. They demonstrated principles that apply to power generally, that violence is less effective than most people believe, that fear of unknown consequences is more powerful than fear of known ones, that restraint, properly demonstrated, creates more control than constant action, that intelligence and strategy can overcome raw force. These aren't just criminal principles. They're human principles, power principles. Politicians understand them. Business leaders understand them. Anyone who operates in competitive environments understands them. The most effective people, the ones with lasting power, they rarely use the full extent of their capabilities. They threaten. They position. They create uncertainty. They demonstrate capability occasionally, but they don't exhaust their resources on constant conflict. Bumpy Johnson figured this out in the context of Harlem's criminal underworld in the 1930s. But the principles are universal, timeless. 1997, a movie was made about Bumpy Johnson's life. Hoodlum. It depicted his conflict with Dutch Schultz, his relationship with St. Clair. The movie took liberties with history, dramatized events, created composite characters, but it introduced Bumpy Johnson to a new generation. People who hadn't been born when he was alive. More media followed. Books, documentaries, TV series. American Gangster in 2007 featured Bumpy as a character, though he'd already passed, and the movie focused on Frank Lucas. The TV series Godfather of Harlem premiered in 2019, fictionalized his later life, his relationships, his operations. Each depiction added to his legend. Sometimes accurately, sometimes not. But they all reinforced the core elements of his reputation. Intelligence, restraint, strategic thinking, fear without constant violence. Those elements resonated because they contradicted the stereotype, the expectation of what a criminal enforcer should be. People expected violence, brutality, rage. They got intelligence, patience, strategy. And that contradiction was compelling, interesting, worth remembering. Today, over 50 years after his death, Bumpy Johnson's name still carries weight. In Harlem, older residents still talk about him. Younger residents know the name, though maybe not the details. In criminal justice studies, his methods are sometimes discussed as an example of sophisticated criminal operations, of how organized crime can function at high levels. In popular culture, he's become a symbol of intelligence over brute force, of strategy over impulse. The real Bumpy Johnson was more complicated than any legend, more human, more flawed. He was a criminal. He broke laws. He hurt people, directly and indirectly. But he also demonstrated something important, something that most criminals of his era never understood. That power isn't about being the most violent. It's about making violence unnecessary. That fear isn't about what you've done. It's about what people believe you might do. That restraint, properly applied, is the most powerful weapon of all. On July 7th, 1968, when Bumpy Johnson collapsed in Wells' restaurant, when his heart stopped, an era ended. Not just his life, but a way of operating, a model of power, an approach to control. The criminal world moved on, became more violent, more chaotic, more destructive, but his legacy remained. In the stories people told, in the lessons people learned, in the example he'd set, of a man who controlled Harlem for decades without becoming the most violent person there. Of a man who built fear not through constant bloodshed, but through careful, calculated consequences. Of a man who rarely pulled his trigger because he understood something most people never learned. That in a world where everyone expects violence, where everyone's prepared for violence, the most dangerous weapon is the one they never see coming. And the most feared person is the one who chooses not to fire. Until the moment they do. The most feared men are not always the loudest. They're not always the most violent. They're not always the ones with the biggest crews, or the most guns, or the longest list of bodies. Sometimes the most feared men are the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who wait. The ones who understand that power isn't about constant demonstration. It's about what people believe might happen if they cross certain lines. Bumpy Johnson understood this, lived it, demonstrated it for nearly 40 years. He built an empire in Harlem not through the gun in his pocket, but through what people feared he might do with it. And in some worlds, in certain circumstances, silence lasts longer than bullets. That was Bumpy Johnson's lesson. That was his legacy. That's why, more than 50 years after his death, we're still telling his story.